Our prisons, home to some of Ireland's most dangerous and vicious criminals. Behind steel doors and iron bars, their every move is controlled and contained. But what happens when law and order break down on the inside?
When I got to the prison, there was chaos.
A syringe was thrust out in front of my face.
They'd managed to cover every wall with excrement. It was unbelievable.
The decision was taken to take this protest through to its extremity.
And how riots can suddenly erupt over the most unlikely issues.
Whatever got into their heads, they started singing, "Apple crumble or we'll rumble."
Basically, the threat was, we want this dog dead.
Tonight, the riots, hunger strikes and vicious murders inside our jails. Early evening on the 4th of January 1997 in Mountjoy Jail. In the prison separation unit, a number of high-risk prisoners have gathered in the recreation room. There's a tense and hostile atmosphere. Something's about to kick off.
The prisoners in the segregation unit at the time were there for a reason, because they possibly were causing trouble in other prisons or in other parts of Mountjoy prison at the time. Many of them were doing quite lengthy sentences, which would obviously suggest that they were serious-minded criminals.
We were always anxious that we didn't get too many of a kind in the separation unit. One very, very disruptive prisoner you can manage. If you get 3, 4 or 5 of them, the risks and the dangers are higher.
At 6:20 p.m, the prisoners in the recreation room overpowered 2 prison officers who were guarding them. 4 other officers who came on the scene were also taken captive. One of the guards managed to escape and raised the alarm.
I was supervising on the B division in Mountjoy on Saturday evening when the alarm went off. When we got to the segregation unit, we got word that a number of prisoners had possibly taken some staff into a recreation hall and they had the keys. So we felt then that, that this was going to be a serious situation.
When I got to the prison, there was pandemonium, there was chaos. A prison operates on the basis that the governor and the staff are in control, and when they're not in control, you're in a very dicey situation.
The fate of 5 prison officers now lay in the hands of some of Mountjoy's most dangerous and notorious prisoners. 3 of those men were heroin addicts and were in possession of syringes filled with HIV-infected blood. Paul Ward, a heroin addict accused of conspiracy to murder journalist Veronica Guerin. Edward Ferncombe, serving 9 years for stabbing a Mormon missionary to death. Warren Dumbrell, serving time for robbery and attacking a woman with a cudgel. And Edward Feary, Stephen Galvin and Joseph Cooper, also serving long sentences for serious crimes.
It was always going to be serious once officers were taken hostage, but the fact that they were taken hostage by people who had serious crimes committed on the outside would have heightened the awareness that we would have had that there could have been serious damage done to the officers while they were in there.
We set up a command room in the separation unit, and I took overall control of the siege. The only access we had was a window which was about 6 feet off the ground in a little small office, and the negotiators had to stand up on a chair in order to get high enough to be able to hand in stuff and to make contact. The prisoners controlled access by having a black plastic bag on the inside, so anytime they wanted, they just pulled the bag across, and it meant that the negotiators couldn't even see into the room. They also had a television, which was a bit of a disaster because that gave them access to the news, so they knew what was being said and what was going on the outside.
As one of the first on the scene, Sean Dempsey became one of the lead negotiators.
Come on, listen, we need to talk this through.
In the early stages of it, it was a bit like everyone roaring and shouting at you at one time, and you were just trying to calm it down.
Come on, Paul, I know you long enough. Now we need to...
You probably would use first name terms with them to try to make it personal as possible, so as to break down any barriers between ourselves and the prisoners. Take it easy. They had themselves reasonably well armed with iron bars and a few gizmos, as they called them, which were syringes with blood and needles on them. They weren't going to come out easily.
Within a few hours, one officer was released as a goodwill gesture, but it became clear the siege would not end quickly.
So another team of negotiators were put in place, and we went up to a fast food place in Philsborough, and there was a television crew in there, and they were talking at the counter. Wouldn't it be great if we could get to talk to some of the lads who were actually over in the block? And we were saying, like, better get this eaten up quick and get back down. So after that, we didn't stir outside the complex.
The standoff has continued now for almost 24 hours.
Over the following 2 days, the hostages were subjected to harrowing psychological torture, exacerbated by media reports on the siege situation. In one incident, hostage-taker Paul Ward became enraged by a report linking him to the murder of journalist Veronica Guerin.
He took grave exception to that and threatened to maim or kill or damage or cut up the hostages. They actually had some sort of a rope tied around some of the hostages to demonstrate their intent and their determination to do this.
Please.
They demanded that this would be taken from the news, and we had to get the Gardaí to try to get the news people to tone it down to reduce the tension.
They were threatening to do things to the officers that do harm to them, break their arms, break their legs, things like that, if we weren't coming up with their demands quicker.
They had syringes that they claimed were filled with contaminated blood because some of them would have a HIV virus at the time, and they constantly said that they were holding the syringes under the throats of the staff.
Well, I was just talking to one of them at the time, explaining the futility of the exercise, what they were doing, and a syringe was thrust out through the window where we were negotiating from towards me by one of the inmates inside. That kind of passed in front of my face for a bit of a second or whatever, and then disappeared again, luckily for me.
What the prisoners didn't know was that a crack team of Army Rangers were preparing to storm the separation unit. Snipers lined up on the roof as an explosive expert assured negotiators that the wreck door could be blown open and the unit stormed. But newspaper reports on the Rangers' plan threatened to scupper the strategy.
My difficulty with that was if they were armed with that information that they'd placed the hostages on the inside of the door and then tell the army now blow away. So I decided that I wouldn't allow them that newspaper. So that caused a huge showdown sometime around midday to either hand over the Independent or they would injure the hostages, and I refused to give them the paper. We did go through a pretty tough 3 or 4 hours where we didn't really know whether there was anybody injured or not because they broke off communications, they closed the place down completely, and there was no sound coming out from it, so it was a fairly tough time.
Finally, late on the Monday night, a deal was reached. The prisoners agreed to release the hostages, and in return, negotiators gave them assurances that they would be transferred unharmed from Mountjoy.
They had a fear themselves that if they came out, that they might somehow be subjected to say, punishment of some sort. The department official came to them and assured them nothing's going to happen. You're going to be looked after, you're going to be taken away, and that's what did happen.
After 53 hours, the hostages were freed. One of the prison officers was so traumatized by his ordeal that he was taken to hospital. All the hostage takers were later convicted and served lengthy sentences for their parts in the siege.
How I felt after when it was over was overall relief that there was no one hurt. It was always the fear. If something happened, that you'd feel yourself personally responsible for the safety of the lads inside. And it was only then that it dawned on us the enormous responsibility that we had.
I remember going into that place that night as the Gardaí were collecting evidence and having a look around and talking to people and saying, look, this place is evil. Evilness happened here and this place should close.
This was one of the worst incidents in Mountjoy's history, but it was far from an isolated case. In a world where violent and unstable men are crammed together into tiny cells, life is lived on a knife edge. Violence in prisons has risen dramatically in the last few decades. 30 years ago, assaults on inmates and prison officers were rare. That situation has changed significantly. Now it's estimated that there are 3 attacks per week on prison officers.
We do know that the overcrowding and the unacceptable regime in the prisons has contributed to the risk to prisoners and to staff. We know that there's been a number of international and national reports that have warned prison authorities here that unless they got a handle on the overcrowding situation, you can expect that you will have disturbances, and that has been the reality.
Naturally, people lose it or flip or whatever simply because the environment is so crowded. The higher the numbers went up, the more aggression, the more difficulties, the more disciplinary reports you had. The lower the numbers went, the reduction was corresponding in terms of disciplinary reports. A great indicator that overcrowding and numbers are a major contributory factor to the environment in a prison.
Rioting in prison is a relatively recent phenomenon. A century ago, protests tended to take other, more extreme forms. Certain prisoners literally starved themselves to death in order to further a cause or improve conditions. And one of the most shocking cases took place in Mountjoy. From 1912 to 1914, 24 suffragettes ended up in prison after mounting a series of attacks on prominent buildings in Dublin.
To gain notoriety and to gain publicity for their cause, they undertook what was called a breaking windows campaign, where literally they go to the customs house or any public building and smash a window in order to be sent to prison.
Rounded up and thrown in prison, they vowed to continue their fight, and they would use one of the few weapons at their disposal, their bodies.
When they were in prison, they went on hunger strike. This was brilliant for media. I mean, the media loved this. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington on hunger strike in Mountjoy. Very well-to-do, upper-class Irish women on hunger strike in a prison. And two of the suffragettes, Evans and Lee, were English suffragettes who came to Ireland and attempted to burn down the Theatre Royal, and they were sentenced to 5 years. That was very serious because they went on hunger strike straight away, and they were going to hunger strike to the death. The attempts at force feeding were absolutely vile and very violent, literally strapping the women to chairs and force feeding them. A tube would be either put down their nose or through their mouth to go down into their stomach, and the liquid food pumped in just to sustain life. I mean, that is the only purpose of it.
This is the medical officer's report detailing the treatment of Mary Lee, and it's not for the faint-hearted. Yesterday, this woman was fed as follows: 9 a.m. milk, Benger's food and 1 egg, total 8 ounces, vomit 9 ounces. 12:30 p.m. beef juice, brands, chicken and milk, total 8 ounces, vomit 4.5 ounces. And it continues. I find there is a marked loss of vital power, and the case has, in my opinion, become one of urgency. During one of the force-feeding sessions, Lee suffered a violent seizure. Fearing her death would cause a scandal, the prison authorities stopped this barbaric treatment and released her.
They literally won. A horrible price, but they won. These are the first people really to exploit the weapon of hunger strike and to see prisons as an actual method of achieving their ends. And the Republicans latched onto this. Basically, they saw the suffragettes could do this. They did it. Thomas Ashe went on hunger strike in Mountjoy, died while being force-fed. His funeral became the seminal moment in the struggle for independence when Michael Collins emerged from the shadow of the Irish Republican movement and basically said, you know, from now on, it's the gun.
70 years after the suffragettes, another more extensive hunger strike would send shockwaves across the globe. This time, dozens would be involved, and many would leave prison in coffins. But these hunger strikers were not agitating for the right to vote. Their protest was a pivotal moment in a bloody and prolonged conflict, the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The Maze Prison in Belfast, scene of one of the most infamous events in the history of prisons on this island. Its H-blocks, a symbol of struggle, resistance and death. Also known as Long Kesh, hundreds of IRA and Loyalist prisoners were jailed here at the height of the Troubles in the late 70s.
Long Kesh was a former Air Force base from the Second World War. So it really had Nissen huts. They put wire up around the Nissen huts and divided into small compounds. The Nissen huts became the prisoners' accommodation.
The first time I went in, it was 1976. It was like looking at something from a Second World War POW camp. And in essence, that's exactly how the regime operated. You had complete control over the running of your own day, from education to recreation and everything else.
As political prisoners, inmates had so-called special category status. This meant exemptions from prison work and free association with fellow paramilitary prisoners. Inmates drilled with dummy guns made from wood and held lectures on guerrilla warfare and revolutionary politics. On the outside, some called Long Kesh the University of Terror.
Today, the authorities displayed the contents of a medieval-style armoury found in one of the Loyalist compounds at Long Kesh.
But rioting and a constant stream of embarrassing escapes led to a fundamental rethink of the regime.
I think in '75, when the provisional IRA and the official IRA burned the Maze prison down, so that's when the decision was taken to build the H blocks.
In the 8 new high-security H blocks, the lives of IRA prisoners were to change dramatically. Gone was their special category status. They were now branded as common criminals. The lax regime was abandoned. Prisoners would no longer be able to march, wear their own clothes, or associate freely.
The authorities' other intention was to separate the prisoners, break up command structures, and put them into a system in which they would be rehabilitated and reformed.
The end of special category status sparked a bitter conflict between Republican prisoners and staff. In the first stage, IRA prisoners refused to wear the prison uniform. Denied civilian clothes, they wrapped themselves in the blankets from their beds.
You had 3 blankets and you wrapped them around you, and that's why it became known as the blanket man. There was a lot of beatings went on. There was a lot of brutality by the prison guards against the prisoners. It became, in certain wings, every time you left the cell, you know, people were getting badly beaten. So we decided to use the chamber pot in the cell and put the urine out the windows and put the excrement out the windows. After they had boarded up the windows, then you had excrement in the cell and the urine was put out under the doors and it was swept back in on top of us every night.
It was the beginning of the dirty protest. For 18 months, up to 300 prisoners refused to leave their cells and smeared their excrement on the walls.
The smell from the cell was unbelievable. It was just horrible, horrible, horrible conditions. I mean, in one of the cells, when you go in, and they had managed to cover every wall, you know, with excrement, you know, it was just unbelievable how they existed and how they existed for so long.
Not everybody ate all the food. So you got battered fish and mushy peas and potatoes, and you didn't like the fish, you just get thrown into the corner. It's the first time in my life that I'd ever seen a mass of food moving of its own accord. And no, I remember the maggots just crawling up through it.
The government, not wishing to give in, then employed prison officers. They were paid, I remember, £3 a day and a pint of milk for the ones that volunteered to put on protective clothing to go in to steam clean the cells. The reason they were doing it was so that the prisoners wouldn't win. That was their main motivation to do it, not the financial incentive. It was so that the prisoners wouldn't be seen to win.
Relations between prisoners and staff reached a new low when the decision was taken to forcibly wash the blanket men.
Everybody that they came in for got well and truly battered and dragged up the wing, pushed onto a chair like this. And I mean, I actually remember one of them standing on my feet while your hands are held behind your back and your head's pulled back, and they use these electric shears just to shave your head. So when they did that, and we got thrown into a bath, and they scrubbed us with deck scrubbers, it was a terrifying experience.
I was beaten on several occasions. We would have left our cells, and all we had was a towel. We had no contact with the outside world yet. We were forced to stand over a mirror. We were then asked to bend, which literally meant that they want to try and probe you. 4 or 5 prison staff would have got round you and literally would have beat you into bend, and we would have resisted.
Outside the maze, the IRA responded by targeting prison staff. Over the coming years, 16 prison employees would be murdered.
They were told straight they would have to pay a price for it, and the IRA targeted them.
So whenever you cross the line in the prisoner's eyes, that's the first thing they hit you with. You know, Jimmy was murdered last week, it's your turn this week, you're a dead man walking.
The IRA executed from senior governors right down to the ordinary ones who were working in the wings when they found any of them about the place.
And because Northern Ireland's such a small place, it seemed they could obtain your address so easily. So you had that threat always hanging over you. It was just a terrible time.
But the worst phase of this protest was yet to come. The British government, now led by Margaret Thatcher, refused to yield to the prisoners' demands for political status.
Murder, maiming, bombing, violence, or crimes.
Now the prisoners resorted to an age-old weapon. If Margaret Thatcher wouldn't yield, they would starve themselves until she did.
We knew what success or failure meant. We knew that success would be massive, absolutely huge, and we knew that surrender would be devastating. So a decision was already taken to see this protest through to the end, to take it to its extremity.
Well, people have asked of me, were you prepared to die? And the answer is yes.
On the 27th of October 1980, 7 Republican prisoners, including Raymond McCartney, went on hunger strike. They were joined 6 weeks later by 23 others.
The first morning, I said to the prison warder I wouldn't be eating breakfast, that I was going on hunger strike. So that was basically it. The routine then was that each meal stayed in the cell with me. So I had food 24 hours in the cell. Throughout the hunger strike, there was always that sense that your body was telling you you should be eating. But there was no sense of physical pain. Physically, your eyes begin to be affected. And it's not so much your ability to see, but your ability to focus. They say the muscles around your eyes start to get weaker. The medical staff had told us to drink plenty of water, and they would have put salt into the water, which was to help your vital organs. And you find your sense of smell becomes very, very acute.
So what happens to the body during periods of starvation? Philip Newsholme is head of biochemistry at University College Dublin and is an expert on how the body reacts to stressful situations.
The most obvious signs at the early stage of a period of starvation will be the loss of fat tissue around our waist and the upper legs, upper arms, and also our muscle tissue, so the patient becomes extremely thin. As we progress through this period of starvation, going on past the 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks stage, this is when we start to see things failing internally. What the body will do in order to preserve life is to try and make sure that the brain and the heart are looked after at the expense of all other tissues and organs of the body. So our intestines will start to lose their function. The kidney starts to malfunction. It's more or less a self-torture in many ways. The feeling that you're just wasting away.
We are prepared to die to prove that we are special prisoners.
What I didn't notice, but what our people noticed, was obviously the amount of weight that you lost, and lost very rapidly. I can recall taking a bath, and I remember going into the bath and sitting on it, and I actually thought I had sat on like a wooden type scrum brush, and I remember leaning down to try and lift it, they put it out, and realised I was actually sitting on my hips. I think when I went on the hunger strike, I possibly was about 11 stone odds, and when we came off hunger strike, I was well below 7 stone. So he lost about 5 stone.
After 53 days with one of the hunger strikers in a coma, the strike was called off. Under a deal agreed with the government, Republican prisoners thought their demands had been met.
I think there is relief that the hunger strike is over and that Sean McKenna didn't die, but they're confused about whether they're going to get anything or not.
But a month later, the prisoners' hopes were dashed.
The British government has said they won't concede political status, and the prisoners in their statement today have repeated their intention of fasting to the death in order to obtain it.
This time, the hunger strike would be led by the 27-year-old Bobby Sands, the IRA's officer commanding in the maze.
3 weeks before the 1st of March, he told us that he was going on a hunger strike because he had no alternative.
Sands, who was serving 14 years for possession of firearms, asked a reluctant Brendan McFarlane to mastermind this second campaign.
A dispute arose between the two of us because there were other people who were more senior than me, and I actually suggested Shanna Welch, the Vice OC, and Bobby Sands' response to me was that Shanna Welch is my best mate, and if the crunch came and I was at a bad ebb and it was 11th hour and there was negotiations, he says he wouldn't let me die. And I said, well, what you're saying here is like, it's some compliment to pay me that I would. He says, yeah, but you have to, and you will. When the second hunger strike started, we decided to stagger it, that Bobby Sands would go first, followed by Francis Hughes, followed by Raymond McCreesh and Patsy O'Hara at weekly intervals. And the reason for that is you put the ultimate responsibility with the individual. Now, it might sound very harsh, very clinical, but this is the way it needed to be done.
This time, the hunger strike would spiral out of control in one of the darkest chapters in Irish history. With tensions running high and increasingly strained relations between the British and Irish governments, Bobby Sands stood in a by-election in Fermanagh, South Tyrone as an anti-H Block candidate.
Stand, Bobby, political prisoner, 30,000. I declare that Bobby Sands has been duly elected.
Bobby Sands' astonishing publicity coup, a Republican hunger striker elected to Westminster, raised hopes that the British government would do a deal.
We are not prepared to concede the principle of political status for which Robert Sands was ordered to die, nor are we prepared to do so to prevent others taking the same course.
Crime is crime is crime. It is not political, it is crime.
This is the 55th day of hunger strike, and Bobby Sands is dying.
By now, Sands' life hung by a thread. A visitor said he looked like a man of 90. He spent the last days of his life on a waterbed to protect his fragile bones.
And how do you feel about that?
Very sad, very broken-hearted. There seems no other way out.
After 64 days on hunger strike, he slipped into a coma.
People who are going through periods of starvation were able to maintain nearly perfect cognitive function. Their brains were working perfectly well and normally up until the final moments.
In the last hour, the news has filtered through to this community that Bobby Sands has died after 66 days of hunger strike.
In the wake of the death of Bobby Sands, serious rioting followed across Northern Ireland. In the following months, tensions remained so high that the British Embassy in Dublin was attacked in some of the worst violence in living memory.
This is one of the biggest political funerals in the history of Ireland.
In Belfast, over 100,000 people lined the route of Sands' funeral.
In an obvious, overwhelming show of solidarity for the hunger strikers and the late Bobby Sands.
Finally, in October 1981, the hunger strike ended after 217 days. In all, 10 hunger strikers died.
I nearly would have supported letting them die. But it was only when I stepped back from it, when I wasn't no longer involved in the prison end of it, that I realised that it was totally wrong decision, you know, to let people die.
Eventually, the British conceded most of the hunger strikers' demands, but at a terrible cost. In the immediate aftermath of the hunger strikes, it soon became clear that the real victors were the IRA. They'd won a major propaganda coup. They'd shown that they could achieve electoral success, and their ability to conduct their armed struggle continued undiminished. Northern Ireland would face another decade of murder, mayhem, and strife.
The prison officers who had lost their lives and were murdered, I suppose to a degree, they felt let down. They had really given the ultimate sacrifice, and yet the government then gave in the end.
There's no doubt that it has left an indelible mark, not just on me, but on everybody, particularly this 30th anniversary year. This is as raw as if it happened last Sunday. It's as close as that. It's yesterday. It's not 30 years ago, it's yesterday. And that is how severe and how much of a mark that has left, particularly on hunger strikers' families.
Coming up, Mountjoy's worst rooftop riot. How prison officers narrowly escaped with their lives after inmates wreaked havoc.
It was the luckiest time we ever had in prison service that someone wasn't killed.
Inside some of our prisons, the levels of tension and aggression pose a constant threat to the safety of staff and inmates. Last year, 2 Mountjoy prison officers were hospitalised after being beaten by inmates armed with pool cues. Some 70 inmates then barricaded themselves into the exercise yard. It took several teams of riot police to get the situation back under control. So what triggers violence in prisons? Many of the problems, it seems, can be traced back to bad conditions. One recent report of Mountjoy said the prison was chronically overcrowded and vermin-infested and found more drugs inside than sweets in a tuck shop.
The number of violent incidents is high and rising. We've had serious incidents in Mountjoy just in the last couple of months. The Inspector of Prisons says that Mountjoy is unsafe for staff or for prisoners if more than 540 people are in the prison. In the last few months, there's been as many as 700 in the prison on a regular basis.
Any riots or any disturbances in the prison are always frightening occasions, and the whole atmosphere becomes absolutely unbelievable in terms of tension and in energy and of lunacy, really.
One of the worst incidents took place here in Mountjoy in 1991 when around 80 prisoners staged the largest rooftop riot ever seen in an Irish prison. On the 15th of September, prisoners broke out onto the roof of A Wing, which then housed around 150 prisoners, many serving sentences for serious crimes. The following day, the protest escalated when more prisoners were hoisted up onto the roof using sheets thrown down into the exercise yard. Soon it spread to D Wing. By late afternoon, up to 50 prisoners were on the roof.
We gained access onto the roof. I remember being part of a few people who broke a hole through the slates between the rafters out onto the roof, and someone pushed me up with a shield in my hand, and I was actually the first out onto the A Division roof. As I moved up along the roof, just trying to find out what was happening ahead of me, the prisoners came down the ridge tiles of the A Division roof, and they were breaking slates and throwing them in my direction. But when I turned around to see would I get back down through the hole, and there was about 6 officers behind me on the roof, so there was no going back, I'm afraid.
The prison officers standing here in the yard were literally pelted with flying slates that were thrown by the prisoners that had crowded onto the roof of A Wing. As the slates came hurtling down, the decision was made to call in the Gardaí and to issue the prison officers with riot gear.
I was on the roof, yeah. Now a slate flying through the air is a fairly serious weapon. And I faced them on 1 or 2 occasions, and they are frightening. And basically they pulled the roof off the prison.
We brought hoses up onto the roof at that stage to drive them back towards the centre area, but because of the draw on the water and all the different connections on the hose rails, the power was going from the hose, so it was becoming ineffective.
As officers hosed prisoners back along the roofs, it was confirmed that 3 fire engines had been called in to help increase the water pressure.
The conditions were poor. There was almost hand-to-hand struggle between an officer and a prisoner one time. The prisoner had a long lump of wood, and he came up to strike an officer on the A roof, and the officer actually caught the timber. I thought something terrible was going to happen here.
One particular officer was sitting on the ridge, and he actually slipped down along the roof, and a nail caught his trousers and held him on the roof, or he was gone 80 feet to the ground.
I was up on the hose reel at one stage, and there was an officer behind me, and he says to me, Sean, he says, I'm afraid of heights. And I said, what are you doing up here? And he says, I don't know, I just went with it. So we had to get him down off the roof. We had to slowly move him back down and keep telling him, don't look down at the ground.
With 100 riot police now on standby, water cannons were brought in a desperate attempt to get prisoners off the roof.
Now the water was on the roof at this stage, so it was getting pretty treacherous underfoot, and we were thinking to ourselves, is this as far as we can go? When some officer just from behind us just ran past us, everyone said, well, what can we do here? So everyone ran. So everyone up the roof and down into the atrium. So that we kind of, I'd say, more or less came out of the mist, and you could see it in some of their faces. They just got frightened, they didn't know where we came from. They decided that the game was up, and eventually we were taken off the roof by a fire brigade ladder. Probably, I would say, the luckiest time we ever had in the prison service that someone wasn't killed, that someone didn't come off that roof.
Rioting and protests in Irish prisons are not unique to Mountjoy. Built over 150 years ago, Limerick Prison shares many of the Joy's problems, with in-cell sanitation available to only half the prisoners.
The first day I walked into Limerick Prison, the first thing that struck me when I took a breath when I walked into the circle was the arid smell at the back of my throat of urine, mixed with a beautiful subtle blend of body odour and stale tobacco. It started to modernise as time went on, because what a lot of people don't realise is that prisoners' living conditions are my working conditions, and I'm determined to improve them.
But some prisoner complaints have little to do with any meaningful problems.
At one stage, we got what we call the Dublin Mafia done. They were in gangs, that we hadn't come across people in gangs before like that. But at one stage, out of the blue, and for no reason whatsoever, they demanded apple crumble for dessert. And we were looking at apple, you know, so we went down to the kitchen and, what's for dessert, chef? Ice cream, why? They're looking for apple crumble. So He told us they weren't getting it, so we went back up and said, there's no apple crumble. Whatever got into their heads, they started singing, you know, apple crumble or we'll rumble. So we kind of knew the rumble was trouble, so we kind of geared up.
Rampaging prisoners then attacked a prison officer and smashed up the dining room before barricading themselves into a cell.
Eventually, we kind of forced them into one cell where they were all inside shouting and roaring out at us, and we were shouting we were going to come in and get him and that sort of thing. And eventually, we were given the order to get sledgehammers and break down through the wall next door. But I'd say it's a frightening experience to have a whole lot of us outside the door with batons and shields and fellas with sledgehammers on the wall, so they stopped after that.
On another occasion, the trigger for violence was a 5-year-old spaniel. In August 2007, Rocky began his crime-fighting career in Limerick and had a knockout success detecting drugs smuggled into the jail. The spaniel was averaging 10 busts a day in the prison visiting area. Across our prisons, sniffer dogs have been deployed since 2007 to detect drugs. But Rocky's knockout success soon raised the hackles of Limerick prison inmates. Prison visits suddenly plunged, and inmates found themselves starved of drugs. In retaliation, prisoners rioted and smashed up their cells in protest.
The prison almost came to a standstill. The vast majority of the prisoner population doing a sit-down protest in the exercise yard. This was a major statement of their anger, their frustration, and tensions were high for several weeks after the arrival of Rocky.
Such was Rocky's success that the spaniel may have been living on borrowed time. It's alleged inmates contacted their criminal associates on the outside and ordered a hit on Rocky's life.
Basically, the threat was, we want this dog dead. My understanding is that a monetary sum from anywhere from a couple of €100 to a couple of €1,000 was offered if Rocky was to be killed. They weren't really too fussy as to how the outcome was achieved. Obviously, at the time, the Limerick feud was at its highest. There was a lot of gangland-type shootings. One would presume that that was one possibility.
Luckily for Rocky, attempts to kill him failed. The spaniel continues to enjoy a successful drug-fighting career.
Following on from that, the prison service decided to continue their campaign of cracking down on drugs, and today the problem is not half as serious as it used to be.
Coming up, the Dublin joyriders who rioted and wrecked Spike Island prison, leaving the government's prison strategy in ruins. In the 1980s, Ireland was in the grip of a joyriding epidemic. In 1984 alone, 10,000 cars were stolen by joyriders, and their rampages through towns left 5 people dead.
Young, badly behaved thugs in this city who have no respect for their neighbours' lives or their properties. The warning is loud and clear. They'll be processed through the courts and they'll be kept in the jails of this country.
But with prisons overcrowded, where would they go? With few options on the table, the government settled on Spike Island off the coast of Cork. Classed as low-risk offenders, the joyriders would be sent to Spike, which would be run as a low-security, open prison. The problem was that Spike Island had been designed to keep people out and not keep people in.
Spike Island had been a military detention barracks. It was built about 1790, and other than having electricity on the island, little had changed on the island from the time the British built it in 1790. We arrived on Spike Island on the 1st of April 1985, which we thought was a bit ironic because 1st of April is supposed to be All Fools' Day. But within 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks, we had the first prisoners on the island. And it wasn't really fit for purpose enough. Wooden doors in the dormitories. They was only used to keep them in at night. They wouldn't keep sheep in many ways.
But there was another potentially more serious issue which would ultimately scupper Spike's chances of operating as a successful prison. Every prison governor in the country had been invited to send 5 prisoners to Spike. So far, so good. But naturally, the prison governors picked their biggest troublemakers and men convicted of violent crimes.
By and large, if they had been more selective, there wouldn't have been an hour's trouble on the island. It was just that there was a couple of prisoners that were a little bit more disruptive, and when something gets going, they'll all join in.
There was trouble almost immediately.
Last night's escape began when 4 prisoners cut through the floor of their dormitory 1 story up.
Just 1 month after opening, 6 men broke out and escaped to the mainland using rafts, which had been left lying around on the beach.
The workman's raft is lying on the beach unprotected, complete with items that could be used for oars.
Of course, the lads thought it'd be great. We'd get on the raft and we used it, build our shovels, and we'd paddle away off the island. They thought they were on Alcatraz.
Well, I certainly felt that trouble wasn't very far off. I was on sick leave with a fairly serious operation at one stage, and the doctor said, will you go back to work? I remember saying to him, not until I can run.
It was only a matter of time before the prisoners took the law into their own hands. At 11 o'clock on the 31st of August 1985, 14 men seized their chance, smashing the lights in Dormitory 5 before setting the entire block alight. It was left to 12 prison officers on the island to get the situation back under control.
The phone lines were cut. They had no portable radio, so they weren't able to summon help. They were very lucky in many ways that they had a ship-to-shore radio. They contacted Marine Transport, said, call into the police station there beside the Commodore and tell them we're in trouble.
As day broke, Block A was in flames and 68 prisoners had taken to the roof. Other inmates breached the gates and made a dash for the pier.
I was in the house up there and I heard a commotion on the hill, so I came out and all the prisoners running down. Later on then somebody from the prison came down and he told us all to get out of the houses, that there was a boat coming in to take us to Cove. But I was looking out the bathroom window then I heard the sound at the pier, and the boat wasn't allowed to land because the prisoners were throwing rocks at it.
Nobody knew how far these prisoners were going to go. They had broken into the surgery and there were a lot of prescription drugs taken. It must have been quite frightening.
It was time to call in the army.
Troops in full riot gear who marched up the hill to the prison were told their services were not required, and they marched down the hill again.
Basically, they were all coming and going, and the riot squad came in and went up the hill, and they came back down again.
At this point, the prison governor tried to reason with the men, but to no avail. With negotiations going nowhere, a large gang of prisoners wearing makeshift balaclavas and armed with pickaxes and shovels hijacked a JCB and rammed the main gate.
They started a JCB with the intention of driving through the main gate.
Breaking back into the prison?
Yes, it's something of a novelty in the prison service, admittedly. The staff are doing their best to keep the prisoners out at this stage.
Approached Spike Island in Cork Harbour just before 2 o'clock.
By 6 p.m. on the Sunday evening, the two sides were at an impasse.
As the day wore on, the reality of the situation they were in was setting in, and eventually they came down peacefully.
They have to give up. It's like prisoners to go on the roof and protest. Eventually they'll have to come down. They can't stay up indefinite.
After just 5 months as a prison, much of Spike Island lay in ruins.
Oh, it was very bad, yeah. One of the wings had been nearly burnt down completely. The Mitchell Hall was destroyed. The staff accommodation, the roofs are badly damaged and that as well. Now, they did a lot of harm.
Despite the riots, Spike Island stayed open as a prison. In 2004, it was finally closed and the last prisoners were transferred to other jails. But Spike lives on in memory as Ireland's Alcatraz, scene of one of the most sensational riots in Irish history. Next week on Behind Bars, the prison escapes that have captivated the nation.
A guy stepped out of the chopper, masked, Armalite. There was pandemonium.
It was a spectacular escape from the strongest guarded prison in the British Empire.
It should have been almost impossible to escape from.
We decided that we could take over a block. There were shots fired, there were screws injured. It was getting out of control.
So we're without Red Rock for the summer on 3, but we've still got compulsive viewing for you. Thursday evening, there are lots of questions to be answered in the emotional new series of adoption stories. That's Thursday at 8:30. Next this evening, we're live and exclusive in the Big Brother house.